The story of Paul's missionary journeys is a tapestry woven with threads of courage, divine encounters, and fierce opposition. Within this grand narrative, the ancient city of Lystra holds a particularly poignant significance. It was not a major metropolis like Ephesus or Corinth. Yet, this smaller, somewhat remote town in Lycaonia became a critical stage for the drama of the early gospel proclamation. Here, Paul's faith was tested. Here, his resilience was forged. Lystra was more than just a dot on a map. It was a place where the raw power of the gospel met the entrenched beliefs of a pagan world. Understanding Lystra is to understand the very heart of Paul's mission. Lystra represented the frontier of Paul's apostolic work. He and Barnabas arrived there not by grand design initially, but driven by persecution from Iconium. They were, in a sense, refugees for the faith, carrying a message that had already stirred up trouble. When Paul and Barnabas fled persecution in Iconium, they found themselves in Lystra, a Roman colony in the region of Lycaonia. Acts chapter 14 tells us they continued to preach the good news there. This was their unwavering commitment. Wherever they went, whatever the circumstances, the message of Jesus Christ was paramount. Lystra, though perhaps less cosmopolitan than other cities Paul visited, was still a place where people lived, loved, feared, and worshipped. It was a community ripe for hearing a new word, a word of hope and healing. And it was here that God chose to display his power in a remarkable way through Paul. In the bustling marketplace or a public square, Paul's gaze fell upon a man. This man had been lame from birth. He had never known the simple act of walking. He was listening intently to Paul's preaching. Paul, filled with the Spirit, perceived something profound. This man had faith to be healed. With a loud voice, Paul commanded the man, "Stand up straight on your feet." Instantly, the man leaped up and began to walk. The Lystrans, witnessing the instantaneous healing of the lame man, reacted in a way that was entirely consistent with their own religious worldview. Their culture was steeped in stories of gods and goddesses who, according to ancient myths, occasionally visited the earth in human form. Seeing this undeniable miracle, the crowd immediately jumped to a conclusion rooted deep in their pagan understanding. These visitors, Paul and Barnabas, must be gods themselves. They began to shout in their local Lycaonian dialect, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas was identified with Zeus, and Paul, as the chief speaker, was identified as Hermes. The priest of the local temple of Zeus brought oxen and garlands to the city gates, preparing to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. This was the highest honor the Lystrans could conceive of offering. It was a moment of potential triumph for the missionaries, yet it was built on a catastrophic misunderstanding. When Paul and Barnabas finally understood what was happening, that the crowd intended to worship them as Zeus and Hermes, they were horrified. Acts chapter 14 verse 14 vividly describes their reaction. They tore their clothes, a traditional Jewish expression of profound grief, distress, or indignation. Rushing out into the crowd, they desperately tried to stop the impending sacrifices. Paul's subsequent speech, recorded in Acts chapter 14 verses 15 to 18, is a masterpiece of contextualized preaching. He declared, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you." He tried to gently redirect their religious impulses away from idols and pagan deities towards the Creator. For a moment it seemed their passionate plea might be working. However, the situation in Lystra was about to take another dark and violent turn. Jews from Antioch in Pisidia and Iconium arrived, determined to undermine Paul's work. They skillfully manipulated the Lystran crowd, turning their earlier adoration into suspicion and then into violent rage. They stoned Paul, dragged him out of the city, and left him for dead. The stoning of Paul in Lystra was a brutal, life-threatening event. Acts chapter 14 verse 19 tells us that after the mob stoned him and dragged him outside the city, they supposed he was dead. Yet, as the disciples gathered around him, Paul miraculously got up and went back into the city. The very next day, he and Barnabas departed for Derbe. However, Lystra was not a place Paul would simply abandon. Despite the trauma, he would return, and on his second missionary journey, Lystra would become significant for a different reason: the discovery of a young, promising disciple named Timothy. According to Acts chapter 16 verses 1 to 3, when Paul revisited Lystra, he found Timothy. Timothy was already a believer, well spoken of by the Christians in Lystra and Iconium. His mother, Eunice, was a Jewish believer, and his grandmother, Lois, was also a woman of sincere faith. His father, however, was a Greek. This mixed heritage gave Timothy a unique position, bridging both Jewish and Gentile worlds. Paul saw in Timothy not just a convert but a potential partner in the gospel. Paul's decision to take Timothy with him was a significant one, demonstrating his commitment to raising up the next generation of leaders. The bond formed between Paul and Timothy, beginning in Lystra, became one of the most profound and touching relationships in the New Testament. Years later, when Paul wrote his second letter to Timothy, his beloved protege from Lystra, the memories of the persecutions he endured in Asia Minor were still vivid. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 10 to 11, Paul reminds Timothy of his own journey of faith. The inclusion of Lystra alongside Antioch and Iconium underscores the severity of what Paul faced there. It was not a minor incident, it was a defining experience of suffering for the gospel. These recollections were not shared to elicit pity but to instruct and encourage Timothy. Paul continues, "Yet the Lord rescued me from all of them." The stoning at Lystra, which left Paul for dead, was a brutal reality. Yet the Lord's rescue was an equally powerful reality. Paul wanted Timothy to understand that a life dedicated to Christ would inevitably involve hardship, but also that God's deliverance is certain. The scars Paul bore were testimonies to both human cruelty and divine preservation. Paul's reflection on these sufferings serves as a stark reminder that the path of discipleship is often marked by opposition. For Paul, these sufferings were not a sign of God's disapproval or absence, but rather a participation in the sufferings of Christ himself. The biblical narratives of Lystra provide a compelling spiritual account. But what does archaeology tell us about this ancient city? Extensive research and archaeological findings have led to a strong consensus, identifying Lystra with the mound and ruins near the modern Turkish village of Hatunsaray. This placement aligns well with the geographical descriptions provided in the Book of Acts. Excavations and surveys in the vicinity of Hatunsaray have brought to light evidence consistent with a Roman colonial settlement of the period. Inscriptions discovered in the area have been particularly crucial. One notable Latin inscription found nearby mentions Colonia Julia Felix Gemina Lustra, confirming Lystra's status as a Roman colony. The archaeological landscape suggests a settlement of modest size, fitting the description of a town rather than a sprawling metropolis. The material remains provide a tangible connection to the world Paul and Barnabas entered. Today, the site identified as ancient Lystra, near Hatunsaray in modern Turkey, offers a quiet, somewhat understated glimpse into its significant past. Unlike the grand, well-preserved ruins of Ephesus or Hierapolis, Lystra's remains are more subtle. There are no towering columns or reconstructed amphitheaters to immediately transport visitors back to the Roman era. Yet for those who know its biblical story, even the unassuming nature of the site can be profoundly moving. It speaks of a place where history-altering events occurred not in a global center of power, but in a relatively ordinary town. The modern cultural context of the region is vastly different from that of Paul's time. The area is now predominantly Muslim, and the vibrant pagan cults that Paul confronted have long since vanished. The faint whisper of Lystra's powerful Christian past serves as a poignant reminder of the rise and fall of communities and the shifting sands of religious adherence over millennia. The story of Paul's experiences in Lystra, etched in the pages of Acts and reflected in his later letters, is far more than an ancient historical account. It resonates with profound lessons for modern readers navigating their own faith journeys in a world that is often indifferent, sometimes curious, and occasionally hostile to the Christian message. Lystra teaches us about the necessity of bold faith. Paul and Barnabas did not shy away from proclaiming the gospel, even when driven from other cities. They spoke with conviction, expecting God to work, and he did. Resilience in the face of adversity is another powerful lesson from Lystra. Paul was not only misunderstood and nearly deified, but he was also brutally stoned and left for dead. Yet he got up. He returned to the city. He even revisited Lystra on a subsequent journey. This incredible perseverance was rooted in a deep, abiding trust in God's sustaining power. Lystra also highlights the importance of mentorship and investing in the next generation, as seen in Paul's relationship with Timothy. Despite the trauma associated with Lystra, Paul saw potential there and nurtured it. The enduring legacy of Lystra is a call to embrace our own mission with courage, to persevere through trials with faith, and to trust that God is always at work.